We are into day 4 or 5 of major protests in California, particularly in downtown LA. They have erupted against ICE investigations and actions on immigrants. It's turned into something of a constitutional standoff with the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, rejecting the fact that the National Guard has been called in by the president. There are exchanges of letters, various kind of constitutional levers being pulled. And I suppose the two narratives are roughly like this. On one side, this is classic authoritarian kind of behavior where you are looking for some kind of state of exception, you manufacture some crisis, you overreach from the center, and that's how you gain power to the center. That is what many people who are critical of President Trump are saying. On the other side, we are seeing many images of what look like pretty serious, pretty violent protests, cars in flames, rocks being thrown at cops in cars, things that look very dangerous, reporters being shot, and yet some of the, I suppose we'd call them liberal media, are still describing this with that famous phrase of mostly peaceful demonstrations, which of course Trump supporters on the political right are absolutely up in arms about. They think this is unacceptable, it's violence, people are standing in the way of the democratically elected will of the people, and of course the National Guard should be called in. What we'd like to do is to try to unpick fact from narrative, and we have the perfect person to help us do that. Leighton Woodhouse is a reporter and documentary filmmaker. He has been writing a fantastic piece for the Free Press. I would strongly urge you to go and check it out with our friends at the Free Press. In the meantime, Leighton, you've been on the ground, you've been reporting. What have you been seeing in the real world for the past couple of days?
Well, I got here yesterday afternoon. I arrived in downtown LA when the protests had been ongoing, but were just, I think, starting to reach a crescendo. When I came into the vicinity of downtown LA near City Hall, the first thing you see is that everything is just covered in graffiti, anti-ICE graffiti. It's clear that a protest has gone through there. You start seeing people carrying signs, walking out of the protest zone. You start seeing more cops. And then as I approached the 101 freeway and parked and got out, that was sort of the epicenter of the conflict. So at that point, it's sort of an LA tradition to try to take the 101 freeway downtown for these political demonstrations, and protesters had tried to do that. They got onto the freeway, but they were pushed back by the cops, and so the cops had shut down at that time both the northbound and the southbound lanes of the freeway. The entire freeway was shut down. Later on, they opened up the northbound lane. But so the cops
sorry to interrupt, Leighton, but on that freeway is where we were seeing on social media images of cops having to abandon their cars because there were projectiles being thrown at them from a kind of bridge over the freeway. Is that right?
Yes, so that evolved over time. So at first they were not, the pictures you're probably referring to is when they were under the overpasses, kind of shielded by the overpasses. That wasn't the case at first. At first the cars were in plain sight, and people were throwing mostly benign objects at the cops earlier in the afternoon. So like lots of empty plastic water bottles and things like that. And I watched the cops return with what I think was disproportionate force, where like somebody throw an empty water bottle at them, and I would just watch cops pick up their rifles with their less lethal munitions, which are flashbang grenades and rubber bullets, and like methodically look through their scope and point it at individual protesters and fire at them. But then later on, things got much more dangerous, and it wasn't just benign objects being thrown at the cops. So that's when the cops sort of started to take shelter underneath the overpasses. And what I saw was a group of probably a dozen, and then later on more than that, maybe a couple of dozen protesters who were picking up these rocks that were sort of between a road and a freeway on-ramp. It was layered with just these rocks, just part of the hardscaping. And they were breaking them up with hammers into sort of throw-sized rocks, but these were significant, like probably about the size of a squash or something, and hurling them onto the freeway. So the freeway there is about 25 feet below street level. So hurling them onto the freeway and trying to hit the police vehicles and the police officers. Sort of aimlessly doing so, because when you come up above the cops are aiming their weapons at the crowd. So if you come up, then there's a chance you'll get shot. So it was people were sort of blindly just hurling them over. But this was going on for like an hour, maybe longer, steadily. And by the end of it, I mean, the cars were pretty demolished. They were smashed and dented, and the rocks were getting pretty close to hitting the officers. I think it's just dumb luck that no officer got struck. And if they had gotten struck, they could have been lethal. These were like rocks that were big enough to cause severe injury, if not death. And so the situation was very dangerous, and I think even more dangerous. The cops were facing these hazards, but also, it just seemed like not inconceivable that the cops were eventually going to return with live fire. It seems crazy to even contemplate that, but when you're just being bombarded with rocks for an hour and they're smashing your police cars. There was a police car that drove off that tried to peel out really quickly, drive off down the freeway, and somebody nailed it in the windshield while it was moving. So it was that kind of a scenario, and it was not inconceivable that this could escalate into a situation with live fire. And of course, if that happened, then it's like all bets are off, and thank God it didn't. But that's kind of how it felt. The escalation felt, to the point where, it sort of had pre-Civil War kind of vibes, and so it was unlike any other protest. And I've been to some protests that have been quite militant, and this was a different level.
As far as you know, was that the worst of it across the city and across the state, or what other flashpoints have there been in the past day or two?
Well, there was the stuff happening in Paramount the day before yesterday, but I was not here to see that, so I did not cover it. I only saw what was on the news. And apparently that was pretty bad. I did talk to a reporter who I know who was there and who covered it. And he said that it was actually in some ways more confrontational, and probably just because it was all on surface streets. So it was like the cops and the protesters were right in front of each other. Whereas in downtown, they were separated by cops being on the freeway below, protesters being on the surface streets above. But I think there were some more sort of direct confrontations. But I think all in all, this was probably worse, what happened yesterday downtown. Although, again, I can't say firsthand. But it does appear like it is an escalating series of events.
According to your eyewitness account, at least, you would say that perhaps the cops overreached on their side, but they were definitely responding to clearly illegal, violent, and very dangerous behavior. So
Yes.
you, I guess, have some sympathy with them in quite a difficult spot. I mean, how should we, who are trying to make sense of this, understand? Is it just another riot? Is it being in some way stoked, do you feel, from either side? I mean, how is it more than it appears to be?
It did not feel to me to be inorganic. Like, I know there's a sort of a convenient assumption that people who are critical of the protest, or any protest, like to make, that this stuff is all being orchestrated by some deep-pocketed outside organization. I do not for a second believe that was the case in this case. And I've been to protests where that seems to clearly be the case, and this was not one of them. I think it was organic. I interviewed a lot of protesters. They were all just like American citizen kids of immigrant parents who were there because they were concerned about their relatives who could be rounded up. And so I think it was organic, and it was also, it's impossible to fairly assess what happened yesterday without taking in the context of the ICE raids that have been ongoing. What you're getting to is exactly where I think we need to go, which is to zoom out a bit and try to trace the chronology. What are these people protesting against exactly? Well, there's been an escalation in ICE raids in LA County over the last week or two, and that's included some pretty, or several weeks, I should say. That's included some pretty egregious situations of ICE trying to enter into elementary schools. There was a 9-year-old child who was deported. This doesn't feel like it. Well, it doesn't feel like, I should say, it is not. These enforcement actions are not actions targeted at violent criminals and gang members. That's not what's happening. These are sweeps of low-hanging fruit. So a lot of the people who, these just in my opinion, to drive up numbers. So like a lot of the people who are being arrested and deporting are people who are checking in to their immigration appointments. So they're literally the people who are following the law. Even if they're here without documentation or illegally, they're following the process that they're supposed to follow. And then they're being rounded up to the courthouses, which obviously is going to drive people into the shadows. But this is like, these are that, if you were to select a population of the least dangerous among the immigrant community, it would be those people who are going and keeping their appointments with the police and the immigration services.
So this is footage that we saw, I think, on last Friday, which is basically illegals who have arrived at the courthouse, they've checked in for whatever process they were supposed to do, and then they are immediately arrested by ICE or raided or whatever the correct verb is as they leave the courthouse. I mean, just to unpick that, it may feel unpleasant, but if they are here illegally, you know, the voters who voted in Donald Trump wanted precisely that. You know, he won the election. He said he was going to deport people who were not here legally, and that's what he appears to be doing. Is that wrong?
Well, so that's where I think it's important to distinguish between California and the rest of the country, because, I mean, first of all, obviously California did not vote for Donald Trump, but nevertheless we live in a democracy, and, you know, the process is the process. But the subjective experience of what immigration is in California, I think, is different from much of the rest of the country insofar as it's just so normal, and I'm talking about mass immigration. I have lived in California my whole life, more or less, and I cannot tell you that there's been a notable difference in my day-to-day lived experience of California from between now and, like, say, a decade or 2 decades ago. It just doesn't feel different.
In terms of the numbers of immigrants?
Right. It feels as if there's a lot of immigrants in California, but there always have been, and it's just it's a normal situation. So there may be people who are outside of the city centers who feel differently in the suburbs and rural areas of California, and I respect their perspective. And I'm not attempting to speak for them, but I can speak for people who live in the city centers where a lot of these enforcement actions are being taken, and it doesn't feel like mere law enforcement. It feels like a attack on the social fabric of our communities, because these are people who, even if they're technically here illegal on a civil offense, these are people who are just part of the social fabric of the state. So the ICE enforcement actions, yes, you can say with some sense of technically legal accuracy. I shouldn't diminish it that way. You can say accurately that they are here illegally and that they're violating the laws, but I would say that is not the subjective experience of what these enforcement actions are, nor do I think most Californians would believe that this is anything more than trying to have some high-profile perp walks to pander to a particular political constituency. And so that's experienced as an attack, and these protests, as dangerous and violent as they've become, I believe are perceived as in the spirit of self-defense.
So it sounds like you're pretty sympathetic with the protesters on this issue.
I deplore the violence. I am sympathetic with the protesters on the issue. I'm sympathetic with people who feel like they have to defend their communities against attack, and people who also feel like there's no real legal recourse to do so. There's no real, like, effective legal way to be able to resist these enforcement actions, and so therefore they're going out onto the streets. That doesn't mean that I condone throwing rocks at cops. And again, I've been very quick to point out that some of these things could have been lethal, and that I wouldn't be surprised if these protests continue, if it does escalate into bloodshed. But so I'm not drawing a judgment one way or the other on it. That's not my job. I don't think I even have really the kind of the moral license to do so. I'm just trying to explain the complexity of the issue and what it feels like in the context of the overall picture.
I guess wherever you or I may fall on that particular issue, what we can say with certainty is that a very large chunk of the American population would fully support these actions because
Yes.
they seem to me, from a further away observer, like integral to what Donald Trump said he was going to do when elected. You could almost say that the only issue that he's actually being really delivering what he promised on is immigration. Crossings at the border are way down, and now the second phase, which is actually deporting people who are there illegally, seems to have begun in earnest. He's on pretty strong political ground there because it was the central plank of what he promised to do. And yet, we can also say with confidence that most Californians probably do not support it. So you've got these enormous areas of the country like California where people will be deeply, implacably opposed to it. And as you say, it will feel like violence against their community. And that, it's like a unmovable object meeting an unstoppable force. That is why we're now talking about constitutional issues. And that's why you may even mention civil war. I'm trying to work through what might happen next, because in a way, the deportations and the roundings up that have taken place, they're not nearly as bad or as major as they could become. I mean, we're talking about, in this example, it's 100 or 200 people that people are protesting about, or maybe there's up to 1,000 over a few-week period, but there hasn't been a kind of major nationwide mass roundups. We're not talking about families and kids, and the deportations, were they to get really serious, could look a lot more intense than this, and yet it's already leading to this kind of civil unrest. So what happens next if he carries on?
Well, I think it could get bad, but I would say that I think that the way that people are perceiving of this is that Trump has made these very ostentatious threats, and that when you start seeing brazen enforcement actions by ICE that are targeting, again, elementary schools, people who are going to check into their appointments with immigration authorities, et cetera, these folks who are just do not fit the profile of the dangerous criminals who he sought to go after, and people start seeing this stuff, then they're reacting to the direction that this is, the trajectory that we're on, not just the actions that have taken place in the last few weeks. So as bad as those actions have been in the last few weeks, it's more like, okay, we see what's coming down the pipeline because it's been laid out for us very specifically that there's going to be massive sweeps of entire neighborhoods. I believe that the federal government even has the capacity to be able to execute that? No, I don't. But that's the threat, and people are responding not just to what's happened in the last few weeks, but where they see this going. And so I think that that's the passion in the response has been commensurate to those threats.
Do we have any idea how many people have been involved in the protests, or how wide and how deep this feeling goes? Because that will help understand how serious it could get.
If I were to guess, I would say there were probably 20,000 people or so yesterday on the street. The people I spoke to and interviewed and asked them where they're from, most of them, almost all of them, are from LA. There's one guy I met from Dallas, but most of them were from here. They were mostly relatives of, so in many cases, children of undocumented parents, but people who had relatives in their families who were undocumented. They were normal people, not paid political agitators. And there was this interesting situation where the cops opened up the northbound lanes of the 101, and while you see these cops occupying the southbound lanes and all this conflict happening, these rocks being thrown, percussion grenades, all that stuff, there's the on the northbound lane, the traffic that's going by is just a steady roar of honking, presumably in support of the protesters. So I think that that's probably not an inaccurate reflection of the political will in LA. I mean, I think people in LA and in California at large are very much opposed to what's happening. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily honking for the protesters who are throwing rocks over. But yeah, I think that this was organic and that does reflect popular opinion in LA. And by that, again, I feel like I have to be very careful to say this. By that, I do not mean that the popular opinion in LA is that we should be engaged in
Right.
violent confrontation with cops. But I think it is that ICE should not be doing this, and that people have the right to resist it. That would be my guess of what would accurately reflect the public opinion in LA. So I don't think the public is lined up behind ICE or behind the Trump administration. I think the public is lined up around the protesters. But as these things get uglier, those things can change. But I would say that that's probably a snapshot of where we are right now, which could, again, like a day or two from now, could be totally different.
Do you feel like it is a turning point in the kind of resistance movement to President Trump? Because compared to Trump 1, oddly, it's been sort of muted, the resistance movement. I remember in 2016, 2017, there were whole Not My President marches in every city. There was this real sense of kind of widespread civil disobedience or resistance against Donald Trump. And this time around, a lot more people were kind of greeting it with a resigned shrug. They didn't like it, but they didn't have the energy to go out there and fight it. Do you feel this is the beginning of a new phase?
So I was just thinking about this the other day because when Trump put in effect his travel bans, his new set of travel bans, I remembered that I was in LA during the first round of travel bans in Trump 1. And I was at the protest at LAX where it was just swarmed with protesters. And then it was like, this time around, it was like the third item down the list of headlines in the news. It was just like, it was just another day. It was just another news cycle. I think that the two are not unrelated insofar as I think that during Trump 1, there was a feeling among people who vigorously opposed his agenda that there were mechanisms in place to be able to, even if they were facing steep odds, to be able to fight back democratically. Elections, street protests, media appearances, things like that. I think now there's a sense of futility and desperation that has led to a certain level of passivity. But that passivity is not going to last if the threats to people's day-to-day lives escalate to a point at which it is no longer possible to be passive. And that is the case for people who are undocumented in LA and their family members right now, that they don't have the luxury to just be like, well, I hope things get better. So they have to do something, and the something that may have worked during Trump 1, well, actually, the something that may have worked before Trump 1 didn't work during Trump 1 was largely, well, mixed efficacy, I would say. But I think that there's a sort of a broad recognition. I'm kind of mind reading people, and I don't like to do that, but I'm speculating that there's a sense that that the normal routes of accountability and resistance are useless and futile. I'm not endorsing that opinion. Nor am I trying to use it as an excuse for violence. But I think that when, like in every part of the world, when people embrace violent protests, it's usually because, well, there's two things. There's like instigators and agitators and agent provocateurs and people like that who are just purely in bad faith. But when it becomes a popular thing, I think it's generally because there is no sense of any other effective way to deal with the situation. And that is a sad place to be in.
Final question for you, Leighton. You did use the words civil war. Do you think that if this continues, we could see something like that? I mean, you've got the governor of California there someone who clearly wants to run for president, clearly wants to be seen as the primary opponent to Donald Trump on the Democratic side. There's no real political reason for Donald Trump to back down, I wouldn't have thought. He will be rewarded by his supporters for appearing strong. I mean, this regardless of the constitutional law, this political standoff could get much more intense. Could it lead to something like civil war?
I'm not willing to say that yet. I think my sense was that I used that phrase for sure, and because my experience of that moment viscerally felt like kind of like a pre-Civil War moment, as opposed to like these kind of orchestrated routine protests. Even the ones that become violent are often feel, sort of like where this is going and it's going to peter out, and it's a lot of it is cosplaying. That's not how this felt. That said, I think it would take a lot to this situation is contained to LA right now. I think that it would take. Well, let me put it this way: when I was in the streets in LA, I kept thinking about Syria in 2011 when people were protesting peacefully, and I'm not sure how peacefully. Maybe there were violent confrontations. I don't know, but what started off as a sort of a largely peaceful reform movement radicalized as soon as troops started firing on protesters, and then it very, very quickly became an insurgency and a guerrilla war and a civil war. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen in America. I do not expect that to happen in America. I think my kid's going to go to kindergarten next year. He's going to be fine, and I'm looking to flee the country. But it did feel in that moment like, okay, this is the kind of situation where if somebody makes a rash decision and a cop fires a real bullet and hits a protester and kills or injures a protester, then all of a sudden everything changes. Everything changes immediately, and it felt like we were at that precipice in that moment. So hopefully we can walk back from that brink. I don't anticipate any sort of like a massive civil conflict coming, but who knows? But at that moment, that's how it felt.
Leighton, the fact that we're even discussing how close we may or may not be to that is itself quite sobering. Thank you so much for your reporting today.
Thank you for having me.
That was Leighton Woodhouse, reporter and documentary filmmaker. He's been on the scene in downtown LA, reporting exactly what he saw with his own eyes in the factual realm, as distinct from these narratives that we keep hearing on social media in both directions. You may have a different view than he did, but I thought it was interesting just what he was saying at the end there, just how close he felt the moment came to something that could trigger a much wider civil conflict. Let's hope that doesn't happen. In the meantime, we will be paying close attention, and thanks for tuning in. This was UnHerd.